Good afternoon. So I am really honored to be here, and especially to be here with my colleague, Professor King, who actually helped to co-author the book that our moderator refers to. But this particular presentation is about a paper that I co-authored with Dr. King, and it's called Thinking Through a Peace and Reconciliation Process for Americans, Lessons from Ferguson and Atlanta. And it's actually based on the work that we did in the book, Crimes Against Humanity in the Land of the Free. I love the black men in my life. I do. They are my brothers. They are my cousins. They are my nephews, my fathers. I have two. They are my significant other, and they are my best friends. And when they hurt, I hurt, and we hurt. And last night, my brother called me, and he was hurt, and he was frustrated, and he was angry, and he had so many questions for me. So many times, he says, he's seen this story repeat itself, the story of the black man who gets shot by the police officer for some unforeseen reason. And my brother asked me, where are our leaders? Where's the Nation of Islam? Where's somebody that's going to do something about this? And I told him I would share our conversation with you today because I don't have any answers. But he was hurt, and I was hurt, and we are hurt. In an interview on MSNBC, Fadine Santana, the brave, heroic young man who actually took the video of Walter Scott running and then being shot dead by that police officer in South Carolina, he said something I thought was really profound. He said, and he's from the Dominican Republic, he said, we look up to America. He said, the world looks up to America, and this cannot happen in America. But it does happen in America, and it has happened in America for too long. For centuries, there have been crimes against humanity in this country. And but for technology, we would not be seeing some of those crimes right now. This past summer, I had the honor of having the book, Crimes Against Humanity in the Land of the Free, Can a Truth and Reconciliation Process Heal Racial Conflict in America, published. The book basically calls for a truth and reconciliation process similar to what would be a truth commission in other nations, but our nation has gone too far. We're too far along for a typical truth and reconciliation commission. So the book deals with truth and reconciliation processes that are basically community-based. In the book, I ask these questions. Where was the world in the midst of the centuries-long American slave trade? Where was the world in the midst of the lynch parties and the Ku Klux Klan night rides, the African-American Holocaust? Where was the world in the midst of the American apartheid? Excuse me, we called it Jim Crow. And where is the world today when, thank you. Thanks. And where is the world today when black men are being killed in epidemic numbers, at epidemic proportion? So I am convinced that we can't count on the world, and we've got to depend on our higher power to guide us and to strengthen us and to lead us, and that we must act. As my brother said, we need to stop being so politically correct and to start doing and saying what must be done and what must be said. So in the paper that I co-authored with Dr. King, we list two different types of action. One would be legislative and the other would be grassroots. The legislative action would involve us calling on the U.S. Congress to act on two apologies that it made to African Americans. In 2008, the U.S. Congress issued House Resolution 194, and in 2009, the U.S. Senate issued Senate Resolution 26. And both of those resolutions apologized to African Americans in great detail for the crimes against humanity that have been committed in this country. And in H.R. 194, the Congress actually pledged to rectify, to put into action certain systems and certain activities that would help to rectify the consequences that blacks are still dealing with in this country today. And to date, nothing has been done on those resolutions. It's as if they don't even exist. So we need to do something about that. And the other thing that Dr. King and I ask for are more grassroots organizations, because once again, we can't rely on anyone else. We've got to rely on ourselves. So we actually have the opportunity to be involved in 2 different grassroots organizations, and I'll tell you a little bit about the one that I'm involved in, and he'll tell you about the one he's involved in. So I'm involved in something called the Truth Telling Project. And the Truth Telling Project basically started in Ferguson, Missouri, following the controversial police shooting of Michael Brown. And we had our first Truth Telling weekend last month. There were over 250 persons that came. We had 12 different panel discussions, we had workshops, and simultaneous to those panel discussions and workshops, there were interviews that were set up where people were being interviewed if they had encountered direct or indirect violence at the hands of police or abuse at the hands of police. So we're still working through pulling some of that information together and preparing a report for it. But basically, the Truth Telling Project is about targeting the problem of community-based police violence. It's about focusing on the needs of those who are directly and indirectly impacted by the violence. It's about documenting stories, about building a record, a community history of police violence, so we can begin keeping records of these things, because right now there are no finite records that actually document all of the different things that go on in our communities, similar to what happened to Walter Scott, but it just happened to be videotaped. We're ultimately hoping to prepare the collective data that we gather and share it with organizations through reports nationally, locally, and also internationally, so that we can begin to work together for change in America. We want to focus on community-based oppression and racism and devise measures that promote change, healing, and restoration. We want to create sustaining community-based programs that actually involve people in the community being active and making change in their communities, so that we're not looking outside the community for help. We want to document the police violence, to reduce the police violence, to promote reconciliation, ultimately to empower citizens. And then we see ourselves taking these Truth-Telling Project weekends, like the one that just happened in Ferguson, across the country to different communities. And I'm hoping, especially based on recent cases that we've had here in Atlanta, that we will be bringing the Truth-Telling Project to Atlanta. Ultimately, we are determined that the truth must be told. It has to be told. We are determined that change must be made. And we are determined that citizens must act collectively to make that change, because we can't depend on the world or anyone else. We've got to do it for ourselves. And so now I invite Dr. King, and he will share more with you about the violence that he believes may not cease at all, and about the Muslim-Jewish Dialogue Task Force.
Good afternoon, everyone. I saw most of you this morning, right? So for those who I didn't see, God's peace and blessings be upon you. And I just want to talk a bit about when I look at racial violence in America as a sociologist, right? This is a very particular perspective that shines light on things that the average American doesn't necessarily get training to think about. Oftentimes we don't see it from this perspective. But the thing we need to understand about racial violence in America is that it's not really about these individuals. It is done by individuals and done to individuals, yes. Acts are always done by individuals, but our racial violence is structural. And what that means is that it's based in systems. It's based in the way our society works. And so while, yes, there's naked violence, and there was a great deal of naked violence in the instances when whiteness was being created, and I'm not talking about white people here, I'm talking about whiteness, the system that gives privilege to those who manage to get classified as white in a given point in time, space, etc., right? A lot of naked violence, right? But once you get the system up and running to a large extent, the naked violence moves largely to the back. It's still there to remind people that it could be there in a larger proportions, but you shift to a great deal more symbolic, cultural, and institutional violence. Right? Symbolic violence is that kind of violence that is in human interactions, people are reminded that you are valued less than other people because of the group that we define you as being in. Cultural violence has to do with saying that you need to leave behind your cultural ways and take on the cultural ways of what is considered in this space to be a superior culture. And it also includes appropriating the culture that was just told to you that it's a negative culture, and then we'll do something with it that is very confusing because now it's good culture. So for example, jazz, which when I was growing up as a child was very much presented to me as something associated with white people. It was like elevator music. And then to learn later in life, study history, and you find out jazz was the hip hop of its day. It was very much associated with black people. It was very much stigmatized. It was not played in the elevator to soothe you, right? So there's this appropriation process, which is part of cultural violence. And then institutional violence, right? This is, when I say, most people when they say the system, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about how our economic system simply works without people having to be personally chauvinistic. It works to disadvantage people who are not classified as white. How our political system, it works, right? To get into office, some of the easiest things you can do is throw out code words that say, I'll keep black people in their place. And once you get into office, you're talking about all kinds of policies that without naming race, they're what we call covert racism or covert racism is probably the best title. Some people call it colorblind racism today. It never mentions race, but it still works in a very racially destructive fashion for black people and a racially advantageous fashion for white people, i.e. people classified as black, people classified as white. So while these things are going on, why don't people see them? They don't see them because our racial violence is legitimated by the stories that we tell. And we have kind of a progression, if you look through American history, from religious stories into scientific racism, you get biological genetic stories, and today we largely have cultural stories. What's interesting about the stories is that when you look at them, to a great deal, they pretty much say the same thing. They just change the wording, right? It's a style of storytelling changes. So I'm going to focus on the cultural story because that's the one we live in now. There are still some people who buy into scientific racism. I promise you, you can buy a book on it that was recently published. I was in college in '96 when the bell curve came out, for example. There are still people who talk about the curse of Ham, although I think they're very few now. But they're around. But the culture piece, right, postulates that pretty much everything bad that black people do creates everything bad that happens to black people, and that it's in our culture. So really, what can you do about it? This is the culture. Like you've got to change these whole, like it takes you back to that cultural violence that I mentioned earlier. And you can look at the points on it. These are different ways that it would manifest if people were being honest about what they're saying when they say these coded things to allocate things to bad black culture. But the key is that we never talk about bad white culture. We always have bad white individuals, right? And so my argument is that this racial violence that's going on in America is not really going to be fixed. It's not going to stop until we have a very resonant, loud, robust, can't avoid it story that not only black folks and other people of color know and hear and talk about, but that white people really own that talks about white violence, right? A culture of white violence, a history of white violence, a group, right, that perpetuates this violence. I was going to talk a lot about lessons from the Muslim-Jewish dialogue, but I decided I'm going to really focus on one because I think this is probably the single most important one. I'll say really quickly, the dialogue started about August of 2014. What we've been doing thus far is showing a film that's about the history of Muslim-Jewish relations. And after each showing of the film, we have small table-guided discussions to kind of keep Muslims and Jews from getting off topic onto that which we like to argue about. That's the easy way to put it, right? But the most interesting thing that's come out of it for me, probably growing more and more since I wrote it in the chapter, is that the facilitators, all of our professional facilitators are women. And the traits, right, the characteristics that the professional facilitator needs to develop and be able to wield with power and authority are in fact traits that we ascribe to femininity in women in our culture. And it says something really powerful. I know there's a growing literature even on what is going to happen in a positive way. What is going to happen as women become more empowered around the planet and take on more and more positions of leadership in our economic and political institutions? The subtext is there should be a higher level of peace. There should be less war if these women don't succumb to the pressure to act like men. Right. I think that that's probably some of the most important stuff in terms of lessons that comes out of the Muslim-Jewish dialogue, that we have got to do a much more impressive job of moving out of the way and putting women into leadership positions and following the women and following the men who embody gender-balanced types of manhood. I'll take that. Connected to that would be making sure that we have everyone in the room, right? People who come from lower SES backgrounds had problems getting to the Muslim-Jewish Task Force meetings, getting to showings of the film. We had a cover charge that was supposed to cover food. Fortunately, a Jewish sister came forward and provided money for anyone who couldn't afford to come. But, you know, you have these real kinds of barriers for people. You have people who are running families, disproportionately women, right? The setup is really designed with someone in mind who doesn't have family responsibilities, might not have 6 kids. But guess what? Muslim-Jewish dialogue, Muslims reproduce at a really high rate. Right? Very rapidly growing population around the world and in America. So a Muslim-Jewish dialogue in Atlanta, I spoke to many of my female friends, and they were like, I'd love to come. Yeah, not sure what I'm going to do about the kids. And so, you know, you have to have talks about accommodations. So that's the Muslim-Jewish dialogue. But imagine, you know, Clinton tried this in the 90s, but I think that it was coming out of the White House. He had to try to be politically correct, right? So imagine racial dialogues originating in communities, led by folks who know what their community needs to talk about, where people can choose the films that fit their situation, led by women and men who function like balanced gender women, right? They have the traits that you need to make this happen. So those are my insights and the lessons from the Muslim-Jewish dialogue. But in the conclusion, as I wrote it, I came back to this discussion that you touched on earlier, brother, that there was, for a long time, a cultural war within Black America. Well, it's still going on, frankly. The cultural war that you alluded to, that students might come from out of town and look down on the Black peasantry, right? The folks who are just working the land, getting by day to day, don't have much exposure to what we think of as high culture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a cultural rebellion. There was. And it really started with people like Langston Hughes, people, you know, when you think of all of the Harlem Renaissance writers, really, that is the first major mark of the Black cultural rebellion, where they began to say the Black folk culture need not be stigmatized, that the culture of the Black cultural elite, those who get Western education in particular, need not be seen as somehow better. That's the beginning of it, and it moves through Black history, getting louder and getting stronger. And by the time you reach, this is a very important transition point, by the time you reach hip-hop, right? And to some degree, Blaxploitation era film, but hip-hop takes this and takes it to another level. It's now not just the kind of general Black masses. You've now gotten into a point where it's the Black street, right? We're urban population by this point, and among the Black street is the Black criminal class that we don't like to talk about, especially in places like this, where we're showing off the fact that, yes, we're middle class, we're civilized and all of that. There's a Black street. I've lived with the Black street. Many of us have lived with the Black street. And the Black street that has a criminal subclass to it, that criminal subclass has been able to take advantage of the Black cultural rebellion's successes, legitimate successes, and change what it is that counts as Black authenticity. How you get to move freely amongst Black folks and not be called out for not being Black enough, right? Blacker than thou, we call it a lot of times, the whole blacker than thou phenomenon. The criminal Black street, right, has endangered the moral high ground that the Black masses always genuinely had, because they were being not only oppressed by whites, but also oppressed by their fellow Black folks who had means oftentimes, right? This has put us in an interesting situation because the criminal part of the Black street has been victimizing the rest of Black America and is increasingly victimizing white America in something of an ironic revenge, right? You now have white children walking around with their pants sagging, and their parents are confused. Well, they're imitating the Black middle class and the Black street, who are all largely under the sway of the Black street criminal class. That's what's going on. Now, the Black street criminal class has no problem shooting me or you. They have no problem robbing from me or you. They have no problem. If you put a train out to Cobb County, which, right, they're afraid of a train, They're afraid of a train because they're afraid of black people because they don't want to differentiate. But what they're really actually, if you can do an analysis, the group they're legitimately afraid of is the black street criminal class, right? So we're headed to a new place because there hasn't been a black street criminal class that had this level of influence nor this level of clout in our history. We've reached a place that really endangers not just black America, not just white America, not just me or you. It really endangers lots of things. This country can now truly tear itself apart through a race war. Not necessarily today, right now, although I'm not sure, right? That's what happened in Ferguson. There were black folks who had a legitimate protest, and there were some black folks who took it and went places with it, and then there were some people who might have been plants. I'm not beyond believing that. That's another discussion. But the point is that it devolved into something that surprised a lot of people. And there were people who, well, I just need the violence to stop. And well, there's probably some legitimate, almost violence, and then there's some really problematic violence, and we've got to separate all of that out. But right now, we haven't been doing that. So what I'm getting at, and I think what we're getting at with our paper, is that America's in a really, really bad position in terms of this whole global leadership thing. Human rights leadership, democracy leadership, freedom leadership. And it's because we haven't been dealing with our racial problem, our racial violence problem as it exists. We've been trying to deal with it as an individual phenomenon. Throw that person in jail, put that police officer at a desk job. We've got a structural problem. It's going to perpetuate the violence until we deal with it structurally. And we now have a problem in black America that we've got to deal with. So I think that is our paper. I'll end it there.